So yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. We have the honor to give you some challenges or debates on the way, and us, that's Daryna from Ukraine, and Marlene, and me, Hanna, from Austria. And yeah, first we will give a very quick us with a world of where we see uprisings, forces from populism, and also economic nationalism. And then you said all this can be understood, these forces, from a Polanyi point of view through the double movement or counter movement, which I will challenge afterwards. And afterwards you were going to the risk part and also to the mercantilist part, which will be discussed by the others.
Yeah, so in this presentation I would like to cover the topic about mitigating the risks of capitalism, as the author identified in this paper that deglobalization is basically a response to the difficulties.
One second, just stop the sharing because you plug this. So
okay, everything from you.
No, it's fine, it's fine. It's fine?
Our hundreds of followers on YouTube.
Yes.
Okay, there are somebody who, okay. So as the author mentioned in the paper, deglobalization is a response to the difficulties that is raised by the succession of threats and risks associated with the globalization in the capitalism world. So I will point out the key drivers of the risk mitigation. This is production and supply chain shocks, geopolitical risks, upheaval, and financial stability and ecological crisis. And later on I will debate on the questions of the methods how to mitigate all these threats that are connected with the globalization.
All right, and the third part of the chapter was... Oh, now I cannot do it anymore. Right. Oh, okay, now it works. Okay, so the third part of the chapter was about the mercantilism, geoeconomics, and the reglobalization. And for me, there were three main takeaways that I shortly want to highlight as a summary. I think you described well already the comeback of mercantilism that we can see right now in a more strategic and selective way, that countries do trade interventions and control power through productive potential, which is undermining the current liberal order of the world. And then there's this geoeconomic framework as coined in the 1990s that is describing the military shift from military rivalry to economic rivalry. And I also found this weaponized interdependencies very important that you highlighted also, that is looking at more or taking more a material analysis view of saying like, okay, who has most power? It is actually the states that have the central nodes of these interdependencies and these huge networks together, through which the money and the goods and the information flows, and they are best placed right now to harm their rivals, and it's becoming more and more important. And then you pose this question of or reglobalization, and you answered it already that you don't really see a deglobalization in the sense of like a rebalancing of powers, but rather you see a reglobalization from hegemonies using their power to counter and exclude potential competitors to this order, and thereby hindering the transition to a multipolar order, which I will challenge in a couple of minutes.
Okay. Yeah. So in my interpretation of your text, and I got a bit struggled because I read it as if the right-wing populist deglobalization supporters are lumped together with these alternative emancipatory movements, for example, the pluriverse. And I think thereby it's a bit obscuring their differences, and especially their representative strength, which they have. So I will try to reveal them a little bit more again. And first, we were talking about deglobalization, reglobalization. And in the first part, I read that all of these just mentioned movements are considered as deglobalization movements, while also now in your presentations, which I liked a lot, you mentioned already alter globalization, from which was a movement or which was a framing coming from the movement from global justice in the 90s, 2000s, And I think alter globalization is way better to describe especially these alternative movements as pluriverse. So there I have just your little message from the text where you mentioned it as deglobalization. And also, since this whole seminar, joint seminar, should also give a bit of inspiration for some people doing their master thesis on some topics. So if you're interested in commons and commons of knowledge, and I think it's an interesting take to look at Vasilis Kozdaskis on cosmolocalism. It's a nice website, and he really says it's kind of a globalization of knowledge and alter globalization, where we have manufacturing locally but designing globally. And the second part, which I want to focus a bit more, is then that you mentioned that all of these counter movements can be seen or under theoretical lens of Polanyi's double movement. And there I would not really agree, because or I thought it would be interesting to have a bit more focused, more detailed lens on it. That just a quick reminder, we mentioned it, Karl Polanyi says that with the upcoming from free market liberalism and the self-regulating market forces, there will be a kind of unified tendency as a counter movement in order to protect their social institutions. And they want to re-embed the economy into society. And I think thereby it's a bit blurred if they all got under the same, in the same box. And I took as a theoretical stance or background, I refer to Nancy Fraser, who said there's we can see it as a triple movement, where she adds emancipation, and emancipation is actually really saying that also social protection can be very dominated by some classes. And if we are trying to critique the myriad forms of domination, we should add emancipation. To come back to, therefore we can then, this can help as a theoretical framework for differentiate these different movements. And then to come back to my question, so there we see you have her in the text, and then we see who is really protected now or what. And first, I want to mention Mastria Swampa. She's an Argentinian sociologist, and she did her PhD in Paris. And she really says, again, it's about commons. It's about a completely new assessment of territoriality, which means out of deglobalization context. Has an interesting book, and a kind of, she doesn't talk the talk, walk the talk, is open access. And on the other side, what are these populist backlash is really like, what are the Trump is protecting? And there I would say it's also not the Polanyi framework that should be used bestly, because it's a bit of their proposition. While the populist parties think that they are protecting or they're advocates for social protection, they're a bit blind to the fact that their lives and their sense of identity is already within the market logic frame. And so I really like the take from Ulrich Brandt and Markus Wissen, the imperial mode of living, which says unconsciously we are repeating every day in our everyday practices already that all of our life is kind of heavily dependent on appropriation from the past and still today. So just a little reminder there.
All right, and in my part, I would like to point out several threats that you highlighted in your paper. That is collapse in the COVID-19, financial instability, especially post-2008 financial crisis that led to the decline in several sectors, climate-related financial risks, and geopolitical upheaval that is mainly connected to the Russian-Ukraine war, Chinese tensions, Trump uncertainty, that is a new dimension of uncertainty impacting economic and political approaches. And as the risks mitigation method, you mentioned about nearshoring, digitalization, friendshoring, and decoupling. Friendshoring meaning that you build like supply chains and production with the partner countries, with the countries that you trust. But actually I would like to debate a little bit on this, because friendshoring doesn't really eliminate the risks, and it does not necessarily improve resilience, and making a research from different papers, including international monetary paper, I found out that economies with extensive trade across blocks experience the largest losses because diversification is reduced and exposure to block-specific shocks increases. And as an example, I think that it's evident about the Russian-Ukraine war, because previously the EU had strong friendshoring with Ukraine. They had a lot of businesses, and also they were heavily dependent on the supply chain of grains. But as the war started, ports in Ukraine were blocked, and it led to the large price shocks, supply disruptions, and inflationary effects. And on this graph, you can see the inflation for bread in the European Union from the start of the war. It reached almost to 20%. The next point that I would like to highlight is as I noticed that the paper was focused more why we mitigate risk, not on the what are the new problems it creates, because this shift obviously has a major cost, moving production from the cheapest place like China to more secure but more expensive place, as you mentioned, also to Central and Eastern Europe. It means higher manufacturing costs and inflationary pressure for consumers, and also the paper from International Monetary Fund stresses that friendshoring can reduce economy's output nearly by 5%. And the last point is about the US supremacist risk mitigation. Of course, it's a controversial question. I agree with that, but as we have to debate, supremacist implies to the ideological belief in the inherent superiority, and it's about the dominance and the control over other countries. But actually, having researched some papers from the OECD, IMF, it basically says that the first intention of the United States were to reduce vulnerabilities and reduce this geopolitical, to find out the way how to come out from geopolitical shocks rather than pursue global dominance. And these policies are more about the economic mitigation, and it emphasizes output loss and supply chain disruption reduction rather than geopolitical conquest.
Okay, now last critical dimension that we want to highlight. It's coming back to this idea of the multipolar world, and I quote you, and you say in your text about reglobalization that it would be less a case of deglobalization than of reglobalization, with the aim of hindering also the transition to a multipolar order. And I want to discuss that because I feel like many articles cite this multipolar idea, and also one great Austrian podcast. But the question, the question is always, is a multipolar order really a better order? That is a question that's highly debated. And I want to, please just stay there for a second. Just because I feel like we always talk about the diminishing power of the US, and it kind of has this implicit assumption that whatever comes next kind of needs to be better. And if it's like a multipolar world, it will per se be sort of like a more stable or a more equitable world. And I want to debate this. First, by giving some theoretical background. Of course, we've all seen this MCM prime by Karl Marx. Never a presentation without Karl Marx. And also these systemic cycles of Arrighi. You also mentioned Braudel's long centuries. I think the MCM prime everyone knows, but these cycles basically try to put the recent history into 4 big hegemonic cycles, starting with Genoese, Dutch, British to US. And the cycles always start with a material expansion, so going from M to C, and then go on to a financial expansion, or like also financialization, which then leads to a crisis and then the succession of the next hegemon. And the question now is, what comes next? Because Arrighi already said that the US cycle in 94 is already over, and he was thinking, okay, what is coming next? Some people say China, but while they're super powerful, we cannot also not see that they really want to overtake the international order themselves and be this new type of hegemon. Then there's also Galanis et al. That kind of completely new, tried to build on this type of theory and try to implement the idea of chaos. So they say what we see right now is chaos, also in the mathematical sense. I can highly recommend a paper by that. And some people say the multipolar world order is next. But what does this imply, really? Then there's, next slide, yeah. There's Acharya, who also talks about the multiplex world rather than the multipolar world. I'm sure you've heard of it. And I found this really interesting paper where they take 33,000 treaties as a kind of proxy for change in world order. And they say that actually we can see that the United States power is diminishing. Also, if you compare this, here's the US. But then other countries are forming more and more treaties also with themselves, which can also be a sign of a changing world order, not only in the economic sense, but also in the diplomacy sense. So I think the question now that this all leads to is, okay, what happens? If the move away from the US-centric unipolarity is uncontested, does this mean it's going to be a more just or more peaceful world? And actually the literature on this is quite scarce, but people seem to be quite sure that neither multipolarity nor multiplexity seem to be really guarantors of peace. Both increase uncertainty, also rivalries over values, over cultural and political values also, and require more diplomacy, more crisis management and inclusive institutions. And this is all leading to the final question, which is also on our question slide, namely, if reglobalization increases great power competition, how will that influence international stability and who will be at the losing ends of this?
And my question is about how we can assess whether French shoring unintentionally creates new economic or political uncertainties for partner countries and which empirical methods or indicators would best capture this risk.
Yeah, and I have a very broad question, and it's concerning a bit that also right now in Europe we see the spread of populism, and the question is a bit how, from a European perspective, shall we go on? So I take a bit the question from Marlene's podcast. How do we perceive? What kind of globalization should Europe now be working towards? And especially when we think about Europe as a whole, it was one of the most winners, the biggest winner from globalization processes from a lot of long time history. We have all the welfare accumulation from peripheral countries. We have cheap oil and gas from Russia. We have safeguarding security measures from the US. We have cheap imports from China. So a bit like how can we now go on without furthering these exploitive tendencies and dependencies? And I have one personal question, which was all time a bit in my mind when I read your thing and you were mentioning it today, so I will come up to it again. You ended your presentation with saying it also depends on which data you use in order to support your arguments, and you were referring a lot to the elephant curve. And in my opinion, I was really wondering why you refer so much to this elephant curve. It stopped in 2028, especially also the last days. There were new articles coming out. There's also a new book of Milanovic on this inequality. And I think it doesn't really support anyhow this argumentation of the rise of populism alone. It is one take, but so maybe that's just a straightforward question to you, and if you could see that this is also sort of either biased or could be replaced. Yeah. I think we give it back to you already.
Okay, you want to come back here? We leave the questions anyway.
Maybe this is okay if we just sit there.
Yeah, of course.
You make me sweat. Well, thank you very, very, very much for this in-depth and super constructive and sharp criticism. It really will help me to move forward for a number of things, and I look forward to reread the slides. I'm sure that you will be able to share it with me, because you spotted some shortcuts. You spotted some maybe at least some potential confusions, and also some blind spots, I think. Yeah, clearly there is still work to do to respond to those questions. If I want to be short, yeah, I'm regarding the first target, if you want, backlash. Clearly, I never wanted to put forward an argument that there was something like a tacit alliance between right-wing populism and degrowth, if you want, on the other end of the spectrum. But what I try to put forward, that there were all various ways, various response to same issues, which is the excesses of neoliberal globalization in a certain sense. And of course, you can have very different responses to that, and there are no alliance or not necessary alliance. I like the idea of a triple movement. It might be a way to be clear about the two dimensions of the backlash. Indeed, I will think over this. It might be a good way to clarify. And clearly the imperial mode of living, I know it, and it could be also a way to be more specific about this typology, and also the place of Europe, because I don't discuss a lot Europe. Actually, I'm maybe too much frame on the Trump Sea world, and Europe is a bit on the back seat. And this is also good, an important, a promising way to not only to put Europe forward, but also from a long durée perspective, which I consider quite important as well on this debate. So thank you very much for that. I'm not able to respond to the specific question, what kind of globalization should Europe now be working towards? I know on the very broad brush, for instance, Robert Boyer makes this three-dimensional competing regime of accumulation argument, where you have economic competition in the US, political control in China, and citizenship in Europe. If you have a critical stance on what European Union is, citizenship is maybe a promise, but it's not a reality, I would say. So, yeah, depends a bit the level of granularity or generality you are into. And clearly, if you take the imperial mode of living argument seriously, then you should end up with some sort of a weakening of Europe, and this is part of the issue. How maybe a weakening of Europe can be acceptable in terms of justice, or in terms of new trade-offs at the global level. It doesn't respond to your question, but this is more or less a way. Then regarding risk mitigation, so thanks again for all the material also you bring forward, and the constructive criticism you make on it. Maybe just to clarify, but I'm sure it was clear for that. I didn't. I was not there to defend and to take position on those arguments. It's a way to understand basically some processes which can be framed in those terms. So I'm not in favor of nearshoring or of even not necessarily on a different type of de-risking or friendshoring. So this means that clearly there are also a downside and a risk, new risks basically associated to this type of risk mitigation. And I was not aware of those papers of the IMF and OECD, so I look forward to have a look on them. Yeah, so to this question can be I'm not sure whether I can respond to the question, because my point is not about the risk associated of risk mitigation methods, specific risk mitigation method. It's more about how new risk mitigation methods is a way to reorganize the tension between integration and fragmentation. So yes, clearly there are problems with those type of policies, but that's not my problem. My problem is to understand how this reorganize the tension. Okay, but. It can be worth mentioning those findings, because clearly it will also give a proper understanding of the policies themselves. And finally, regarding reglobalization and the stability of international order, basically. I wondered, listening to you, how far you buy the hegemonic stability theory. Because this is a bit of a hidden discussion of the world system theory, considering that, okay, you have those hegemonic cycles, and interregnum are more prone to war than, of course, hegemonic moments. And I've always thought there's a bit of a bizarre dimension of the theory to buy basically the hegemonic discourse of hegemonic powers, that their power is there to serve the interest of others. Of themselves, but also of others. Of course, they do to a certain extent, but it also clearly power policies and a way to control and to reproduce hierarchies. So this is maybe the first point I wanted to make about this. And the second one is that there is no necessity of correlation between modes, type of hierarchies, and conflictuality of the international system. In my view, it's not. There is no correlation. So it's a matter of a substance of a power policy, and also of a political economy as such, and not about the poles of power, because otherwise you are either into a theory of a hegemonic stability, or in a very close and neo-realist argument. I see that probably you had some of those discussions in Vienna, and be it Kenneth Waltz or John Mersheimer, so the big names of neo-realist theory in international relations. So that's a number of power poles which will determine the stability of the system. And there is basically politics has disappeared in the discussion. So this maybe it's very abstract response to your question, but I think it's important to keep this in mind when then discussing about more normative dimension of how a multipolar world can be or cannot be a response to the situation. Is it okay?
Hello. Thank you. My name is Martina. I'm from Argentina, and I'm really interested about how the geoeconomical world will turn out to be. I'm curious about the methods through which you reach your conclusions. How do you approach research to get to this point?
Hi, I'm Eugenia from El Salvador. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, I'm more curious about your perspective on these statements nowadays that they say that from a Polanyian perspective, in this challenge to re-embed economic in society, some counter-movements like deglobalisation have the risk to rising national capitalism. And basically, there's no way to have the three movements, national capitalism and liberalism and democracy. So I want to know what's your view on this stand, and if you agree with this, if you envision a new alternative to actually encourage that this great transformation leads to a real socio-ecological transformation.
Hello, I'm Florian from Germany. Thanks for the presentation. I would be interested in your view on whether some kind of risk mitigation approach can actually increase the risk because the mutual interdependencies are then reduced and therefore the other partner also has less of an incentive to I don't know how I want to finish my sentence, but yeah, the mutual interdependencies would be reduced here. If both parties try to reduce the risk and stop trading and so on, because they fear that their interdependencies make them attackable, vulnerable, then they could also become actually more vulnerable because the other region isn't vulnerable anymore.
Okay, thanks very much for those additional questions. Sharp as well. Regarding the methods, that's a bit what I said just at the end. It's the question of which indicators will make your point, basically. And to what extent you must have some sort of a comprehensive mapping of indicators to bring the discussion to an end, because you have very contradictory process, and this is one aspect. The other aspect is there are big change happening right now, and they are going up and down because the policy process is very unstable right now. And so even probably by the next couple of years, it will be very difficult even to use indicators in any relevant way, because it will take some time to get the indicators, and then anyhow the indicators won't mean much about it. So that's why I'm myself a bit hesitant in terms of really strong argument to put forward. When I started bringing together the chapter, I was more into an argument in terms, okay, it varies according to sectors, if you want, and there are very contradictory dimensions. And after, I must say, I read this piece by Lucas Lindsay and Hanna de Graaf. It's part of a special issue in International Affairs. I don't know whether it's already published or not, but it should be published in very soon, if not already. And they have this very strong argument regarding the suprematist move of the US. And by the way, this is a response to you also, I think, about the exogenous or endogenous dimension of the suprematist part. Oh, it's you. No. It's one of you. Whatever. The critique of suprematism, if you want, is say, okay, this is not only just intentional power policy, but it's also a response. Yes, it was before because of the risk mitigation. Also a response of exogenous risks and vulnerabilities. Actually, you can take a number of indicators that what Lindsay and de Graaf do, showing exactly the contrary. It's not a policy of risk mitigation against vulnerabilities and exogenous risk. It's an intentional policy of keeping and reproducing a power asymmetry. And how do you see? Where do you see? Which numbers do you use for that? For instance, you can, in terms of investment flows, you can see, of course, the part of the US, but also how broadly the repetition of investment flows are or have moved between the 5 largest recipients, for instance, or exporters of flows, etc. And you can see that actually it hasn't expanded so much about. So there is not so much of a spread of emerging powers over the last decade or 2 decades. Typically, you can really see that in figures. And then, but you can do that in trade, you can do it in production, you can do it in finance, in health, in intellectual property, innovation, etc. And according to a number of studies right now, if you take you try to provide evidence on this basis, the only dimension where you have a real and strong trend of an emerging Chinese power is on innovation. Regarding the counter-movement and national capitalism, that was the question. Again, regarding these various drivers and of deglobalization. As I said before, it's not, I don't put them all in the same basket, even though all of them respond to some excess of a neoliberal globalization. To respond to a question depends upon which criteria you would define which response would be the most promising. That was a bit the question you had. No? So if it's in terms of socio-ecological transition, clearly national capitalism won't do the job. It won't do the job. You'll need to go beyond that. And this is the whole debate on degrowth. If it's in terms of saying, okay, degrowth won't do the job in terms of expectation, in terms of consumption on the worldwide basis, so that's some sort of climate capitalism which will do the job. So again, it depends what the basically view you take in terms of the poly-crisis, the current poly-crisis. If you say, okay, now the biggest threat is Russia, well then you'll do different. You'll have another response also in terms of national capitalism and counter-movement. I'm sorry, I cannot tell you more. It's really a policy-oriented response that you have for this type of question. And finally, risk mitigation and the contradiction of risk mitigation and increase of risk. It's basically what I just said regarding Daryna, the question. Yes, of course, but it's not really the object of the problematic I tried to discuss in that section.
Hello, I'm Ben from India. So recently I've been trying to learn about inflation in general. And one thing I realize is that with how the globalization is changing, the countries are trying to become more reliant. They are focusing more on energy and security than the previous type of globalization supply chains, which tries to make the cheapest supply chain line possible. And from this aspect, with how the introduction of CBAM and other policies are working, the naive perspective of mine is that there could be an inflation across the world in all countries. And what do you think about this? And will there be a structural change in inflation that in the upcoming years to come, every country is going to experience a sharp rise in inflation? But it's a very naive question, and I would like to know how to look at this question and from what perspectives to learn about inflation with respect to how globalization is changing. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Diego from Switzerland. Diego from Switzerland as well. I wanted to ask you, maybe it was in your presentation, but I didn't get it, where these changes originate really, like where they come from, whether these are changes of ideas or more just power shifts in a sense, because the way I understand it also by looking at your examples, I cannot really avoid but thinking that all these shifts, for example, back to mercantilism is just an adaptation strategy of the dominant forces of the USA mainly. Whereas liberalism, I think, worked really well in the expansion phase of power. I think at some point it stopped working. The way I see it is more like maybe from a realist point of view. Or I want to ask you what your opinion is, like where it originates, if it also like in terms of countries, but also whether it's more power or ideologically.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I'm Sharmeen from Pakistan. So my question was basically that I understand that this move towards like neo-mercantilism and like a new industrial policy within the global powers like the US is a response to the vulnerabilities that they're facing in the geopolitical tensions due to the rise of China. But what I want to understand is that what I maybe missed in your presentation is like that there is not much focus on like developing economies and how, for example, IMF conditionalities and policy frameworks are a lot about opening up economies, privatizing, and they're very much against, like a reemergence of industrial policy. So in this way, when US kind of does whatever it wants, whenever it suits them to liberalize their economy or to move towards an industrial policy, what can developing economies do in this instance to adapt better, but at the same time not be kind of like a reactive strategy to, okay, this is what IMF tells us and we need money, so let's just do this, let's just liberalize. But at the same time, all the other big economies are, moving towards an industrial policy and protectionist measures. So yeah.
Thanks again for these great questions. I think it will not be a 128 pages, but a 3-volume book with all those questions. So, on Ben, on the inflation question, I give up. I'm really not a specialist on that, and I don't have any interesting things to say on that. So this is my trump card. Maybe David has more to say on that. Regarding drivers, origins, and causality, basically. Again, I think there is no one causal mechanism in the transformation of the tension between integration and fragmentation of global capitalism. There are really congruence, plurality of drivers, and the idea of organizing this plurality of drivers into this typology of basically 3 targets in terms of excess of market-based globalization, excess of risks in the organizing of capitalism, and reframing of the relation between interest, power, and space. The whole exercise was to see that the picture is really complex and multidimensional. And again, if you want me to tell you whether it's power or ideology, I'll tell you both, my dearest, because this is how the power issues are understood. They don't exist as such on a purely material basis, but of course you need representation to make power acceptable and reproducible. So that's all I can tell you, and you won't have a tick in the box causal mechanism type of response.
Yes, you forgot her question.
Excuse me. Yes, regarding new industrial policies of developing countries, absolutely. This is part of the geoeconomics and neo-mercantilism world where we're living in, and the whole discussion of state capitalism, if it started, as I said, more with large emerging economies, it's also part of a second, third tier developing countries who can claim some sort of development space in organizing their development policies. And we could say it even started at least more than a couple of decades ago with the famous report of the World Bank on state institutions in the mid-90s, if I remember well. And since then, even the Bretton Woods institution recognized the role of institutions. And if you take also the more recent time of the sovereign debt crisis, so it's not about developing countries, but the IMF was the progressive guy in the room, as compared to the European Central Bank and the European Commission. It was the IMF saying, hey guys, pay attention. Huh? Too much austerity will not make the job there. So I'd like to be the devil's advocate here and saying you have to recognize that an institution like the IMF has evolved also, and in some way. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. So you think it's just repackaging, or?
I think there is some change, yeah, in terms of macroeconomic policy for the IMF, but probably the change is not applied the same way depending of the countries concerned.
Okay.
Hello, thank you again also for your presentation. My name is Luca, I'm from Germany and Brazil. And my question, yes, my question would be, because you were talking about mercantilism and globalization and so on, and one author I really like about this subject is Samir Amin, because he makes a step further before mercantilism, explaining tributary modes of production before capitalism, and like what he explains is that Eurocentrism is like the ideological substract of capitalism as a mode of production per definition. And my question would be, like, also in dialogue with question 1 from the group, is like, considering that the immediate hegemon in the world system is the US, which is not a European country, how would you see Europe in this sense? Because if you look at like the leading Trumpist ideology, it is maybe historically Eurocentric, but it's first of all America first, so it's not Europe-centered in that sense. How would you evaluate like the role of Europe in this context regarding that? Like, maybe would you agree with the fact that maybe Eurocentrism became so irrational at the point that it prevents Europe from cooperating with China, with other countries that would, preventing Europe from engaging in economic cooperation that would be much more beneficial because of this Eurocentric factor within capitalism? I would like to know if you agree with this contradiction and how we can think this.
Hello, Theo from Germany. There is this kind of thinking in Europe where we believe that economic integration would contribute to the peace, long-standing peace within regions. So this was also one of the key thoughts of the founding of the European Union. Would you say that is also, I mean, for Europe, it maybe has worked in the past, but would you say it's also valid for the global dynamics? Because if you look at today's geopolitical tensions, it might have caused quite the opposite, actually.
Hello, I'm French. First, I want to echo Luca and Marceau. I'm French. I wanted to echo Luca and Samir Amin because I was also thinking about one of his concepts, which is the linking. And so you used a lot of concepts today, so I want to bring more concepts to your concepts to try to look at what are the tensions and synergies between them. So here I bring the linking. So I wanted to know a bit more about your thoughts about the tensions with the linking and deglobalization and reglobalization theories. And I want to add another one from Fabian Giorgi, because I heard about weaponized interdependencies, and you also mentioned migration and nationalism stuff. And so Fabian Giorgi talks about fortress capitalism. So how much basically capitalism is securizing the border to maintain its control over capital by impeding some people to get access to it. And I wanted also to know what are your thoughts about this regarding your theories. Thank you. Super broad, sorry.
Thank you, and I just add Hanna. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Luis from Germany. If we talk about a new wave of globalization, in 1945, the idea of globalization was that in all these international institutions that we founded, every nation, independent of the stance in the world system, was part of it. The UN is the best example for it, where even countries that are basically pariah states like North Korea can participate in. Should we go for such an approach again or not? I mean, the WTO has aside the WTO, we have this established alternative without the US to maintain some form of international governance, but we leave nations outside of the table. And if we say the main goal has to be to somehow avoid weaponized conflict resolution, can we have a form of globalization that excludes, for no matter what reason, some countries?
Okay, and then maybe I had a very, very simple question. How is Switzerland currently with the tariffs on drugs?
Exempted. It has always been exempted. Tariffs on the pharma. Yeah. Pharma and gold was exempted. It was for 50% of the US Swiss exposed to the US. So. No, but now there is a negotiation 5 days after. I think 7 Swiss CEOs were in the Oval Office. Deal was done. And we are back at 15%. Thanks again for all more challenging questions. Maybe I will finish at ICU in 15 minutes. But so I do my best. So we start with Luca from Brazil. And German. Half German, okay. Okay. So that's the tension in which you are, the question of the Eurocentrism contradiction. You're in the middle of the South Atlantic. I must say, it's a bit difficult to respond to those normative questions. Mm-hmm. Because I see it as a normative question. What should Europe do regarding such and such? I'm not here as a counselor of the European Commission, and when we say what such and such entity like Europe should do, we first have to question who is Europe, or what, and do for whom, for what purpose. So it's very difficult to respond to those questions. for what you define as the collective interest of Europe, but you know the European industrialists claim to do the collective interest of Europe altogether, being they consider themselves as the drivers of growth, for instance. So maybe the hidden question was how far should Europe break the Atlantic Alliance? Was this the question? Okay. First of all, well, you know that if it's on military and strategic terms, European defense has no autonomy, and a break of the Atlantic Alliance would weaken enormously European capacities in terms of military and strategic dimension. So it's not a one-off, it's not a 1 or 0, it's a question of a process, and I'm convinced that what has happened over the last 6 months, 11 months, reinforce a process. Again, it's a question of a process towards more strategic and economic autonomy for the main European powers. But you remember that before the election, Trump was threatening Europe and NATO of dismantling NATO, or maybe just moving out of NATO, which is of course not at all the game in town. Does it clarify a little bit? Okay. So Theo, this time entirely from Germany. Where is? Yeah, here. No, there. Yeah. Maybe. No. Yeah, I cannot agree more with you than, of course, the liberal peace myth is more myth than anything else. The whole theory also on the democratic peace. There is some many American theorists which has developed quantitative work on that, etc. And yes, of course, it's a peace at the core and conflict at the periphery. And even peace at the core can always end up in war. International relations live under the shadow of war. So that's not because you have 75 years of peace that you don't have a risk of war. So it's such a basis of international relations assumptions that is here, even before the political economic content of the liberal order established after 1945. Marceau, again Samir Amin, but this time for the linking. It's a bit the same problematic than the question of the Atlantic Alliance discussed with Luca. The linking is very appealing, but again, what are the power relations on which you can conceive the linking, considering again the level of integration and the cost of the delinking itself. So if it's a strategic aim in terms of autonomy, it's not delinking anymore. It's the same issue with decoupling, which is not so much in the north-south dimension, but more in the east-west dimension. There is a lot of talk in town about decoupling, but nobody will decouple from China for decades or ever. Then, this is why I'm more in favor of this discussion of cosmo-localism and the role of autonomy, as also discussed with Gortz, than maybe more mechanistic understanding of decoupling. And so maybe it's a bit extreme, but probably there is one country which tried to apply the Samir Amin. It was Cambodia under the Red Khmer, and it was not such a good experience, I think. Last one, Luis. Sorry? From Germany. Post-1945 universalism. And could we go beyond, basically? Is this a way to understand the question?
Can we go back to this, and is it possible in like international institutions like the UN and so on to not go back to this? Like, should we go? Can we even go for globalization that does not have like the vibe of 45?
Yeah. Well, very, very important point indeed. And it's again a bit about the politicization of international law. And again, international law does not exist as such. It is a compass, if you want, or basic rights on which you fight to defend such claims. And if you consider that 1945 universalism is based on this understanding of international law, then it doesn't mean necessarily that it's westernization, imposition of basically of northern dominance over the rest, the West and the rest. But actually, there is also an apparatus which can be appraised by subaltern actors for their own rights. So in this way, maybe I'm a bit, I'm a traditionalist, but I think the post-1945 order is still a reference for progressive claims, and despite all the critique that could be, of course, addressed to the way it has been used in over the last 80 years.